All right, there we go. When I was first drawn to Scandinavian music as a young student, I found it nearly impossible to learn about Nordic or Scandinavian music history, even with access to a state college library. This is also discounting the resources available in the Nordic languages, which are not the most accessible for Americans like myself to learn. But as time has gone on in the last decade, this information has become more widely accessible in more languages due to social media and the internet, but found only scattered across various platforms presented in unorganized and even often untrustworthy sources. So then, years later, in the interest of doing my part as a musicologist in not only preserving the knowledge of Nordic and Scandinavian music traditions, but also making this knowledge available to those who seek it, I founded the Nordic Sound in 2020 in the hopes of creating a single, reliable place to learn about the music and lore of this beautiful region on the edge of the world. And without much pretense, I have done quite a lot already over the years, but this project has never really been pursued alone. For along the way, I've been fortunate enough to have the support of my patrons over at patreon.com/Nordic Sound. I haven't really talked about Patreon on this channel in years, and that's because I've felt more like the meme of Patrick Star with the board on his head whenever I try and make something coherent out of it. But what I've learned through all of the trials, the hits and misses of my Patreon experiments is that really no matter what it looks like, what really matters to all of you is supporting this project in a meaningful way. In other words, no matter what is over at Patreon, that's never really what's been important, and I've been very fortunate enough to have patrons that really just want to see this project succeed, and doing their part in helping the Nordic Sound grow as a source for all to learn about Nordic and Scandinavian music from someone who you can be confident is not entirely full of shit. So since this channel has grown quite a bit since I last talked about Patreon, I wanted to sort of take a moment to highlight the ways that you can support the project if you so desire. So let's talk about the biggest makeover that I've given to the Patreon in quite some time and why it's worth your while to check it out if you too want to help me build a truly reliable place or a musicological archive for Nordic and Scandinavian music. So at its most basic level, it's not just the growth of the channel, but just the basic upkeep of it that costs a surprising amount of funds. Web hosting, podcast hosting, video design software, graphic design software, and so many other little things add to the monthly upkeep cost of the Nordic Sound. But on top of those little upkeep costs, growing my own collection of resources to use for the Nordic Sound, books, texts, manuscripts, physical copies of CDs and vinyls, which often contain incredibly valuable information in them, I've mostly invested in all these things out of pocket, essentially. These are the things that directly enrich what you get here on the Nordic Sound, and I have just 3 examples for you guys. First is Karen Larsson's History of Norway. Anytime I've talked about Norway, the history of Norway on this channel has pretty much been reliant on the knowledge and information I've gotten from this book. Be it the composer biographies, any videos on the medieval period, or the independence movement especially begin with the content of this book, which cost me $120 out of pocket as a grad student. But without it, the quality of the content of the Nordic Sound would be quite worse off. Same goes for New Music of the Nordic Countries, an edited volume on Nordic music since the 20th century, with short histories on each country's music history since the medieval period. Now, Alyssa, my wife, got me this book as a birthday present a couple years ago, but it did cost over $100, but that was a deal because Mercer University in Georgia, their library was cleaning house and had no use for it, so this cost that much even while it was on discount. And then lastly, just to shift things up, is actually a favorite of many of you I know, the vinyl edition for Einar Selvik Vardruna's Skald album contains within it a beautiful write-up from, what is his name again? Bergsvein Bergesson wrote this beautiful write-up on Skaldic history that really, as far as I know, can only really find in the sleeve of the Skald vinyl or the Skald CD. And again, the amount of rich history and historiography on Skaldic practice and Skaldic tradition within this this album liner essentially has just been incredibly useful for me understanding some more ins and outs of Skaldic history that I honestly haven't been able to find elsewhere. Now, all of this is to say that, yes, talking about money is weird and often uncomfortable, but the growth of materials and resources that directly enrich the Nordic Sound as a public archive on Nordic and Scandinavian music history isn't cheap. But luckily, I have had the support of patrons over the years, current and prospective for those of you watching this video. The goal of growing the library needed to make the Nordic Sound the best it can be is all the more attainable with your help. So if you would like to help put your stake in the Nordic Sound, then there are currently 2 tiers over on Patreon. The patron tier for $5 and the seeker tier for $10. Now, pledging to either tier, if even for just a month, earns you a spot in the dedicated patrons hall featured on the new website that I and the patrons have already been collaborating on, the Nordic Sound Archive. This is the current big picture long-term project for the Nordic Sound, benefiting most from the patron support, especially because of its reliance on resources that I just mentioned. Now, the Nordic Sound Archive is the true realization of the vision that I stated at the top of this video, a single, reliable place for seekers of the world to come and learn about the rich music history and history in the making of Nordic music. The website will feature every interview I've ever done, or will ever do, with additional biographical context for the guests, a blog you can subscribe to via an email mailing list featuring the essays which eventually become the scripts for the videos featured here on the channel, such as the Viking music video I did a few months ago, and the Viking instruments video coming later this year. But maybe even more importantly, for those of you who have been here since the very beginning, this Nordic Sound Archive will feature a dedicated archive of Nordic composers for those of you who miss the classical music days of this channel and that this channel was founded on but has sort of slipped out of my grasp with all of the work that has piled up recently. My issue has been how to sort of divide attention in terms of videos and podcasts between the music of today, the medieval stuff, the Viking stuff, but then also what seems like a very different world that is classical music. But on the Nordic Sound Archive website, I will have a dedicated written resource with biographies and, referenced works, suggested works, and all of that from the composers. So for those of you who support this channel and have followed this channel since the very beginning, this archive will actually be the best way for me to keep up to date with giving you guys the resources and the stories that you crave about the classical composers of the Nordic region. Really, rather than waiting for the decades it would take for me to complete this list, or maybe even write a book or 2 on it, I will simply add to this online archive over time, a benefit of being a living archive. So the Nordic Sound Archive is the foundational mission of the Nordic Sound fully realized, bringing together all of the work that I've done over the last half-decade on Nordic music research. So joining the $5 patron tier will not only eternalize your name upon the Nordic Sound Archive's patron hall, because I do really plan for this thing to outlive me in a morose way, or maybe even an optimistic way, but it will also give you access to the Nordic Sound Discord so you can talk and meet with others who also love all things Nordic music. On this Discord, we have a channel for new music, a channel for concert experiences, and of course a channel for feedback to help keep me humble. The Seeker tier, ironically the most popular one of the 2 so far, with more pledges there, comes with a fair bit more engaged content between us. The Seekers are those on an endless quest for wisdom, following in the footsteps of the wisest god of all, who also sacrificed much for the sake of knowledge. As a Seeker, you gain more insight into the process of research, writing, and archiving that makes the Nordic Sound what it is. I will share with you my works in progress, interesting manuscripts, images, and other media that I come across in my studies, and will post more thought-provoking musicological questions which those in the musicology discipline are often nagged by. And as a seeker, you do genuinely come with me on the journey of seeking knowledge and understanding of Nordic music history as well as its present. If nothing else, it gives you a taste of what it's like to be a musicologist or a historian at the doctoral level, giving you a hands-on, behind-the-scenes look at the work that people like me are doing. Then what I want to give you guys is a concrete plan for the patron funds, which I feel like a lot of Patreon pages just happen to never address, and that is the funds from Patreon stays in their own separate account, a treasury of sorts for the Nordic Sound. This treasury will be used only for the operating costs of the podcast and the website, all those monthly costs that I mentioned at the top of the video. But then in terms of growing, the collection of books and resources I have yet to add to my personal collection, which directly enriches the quality of the content on the Nordic Sound. Manuscripts of old poems, CDs, and records only available in physical copies from Discogs and other trade platforms. New albums themselves, which have physical collector's copies containing valuable knowledge, just like the Skald vinyl, and old books of folklore and traditional dance tunes, and so much more reference material. Those of you who wanted to get Ross Hagen and Mathias Nordvig's new book, The Ancestral North, you all talked to me about how you wish you could get it, but it costs so much money. That is the exact position that I'm in here when I am trying to create resources that I can use for the Nordic Sound. So believe me, I understand, and that is sort of what the Patreon is here to help me deal with in a lot of ways. All of these things would cost me just my own money if not available through my libraries and without the help of the patrons that I've already had over the last few years. But on top of that, each time I do add something new to the Nordic Sound collection, I will share that with the patrons and give a little background on it for the seekers as to why it was so important to add to the collection for the Nordic Sound archive. So by supporting the Nordic Sound, you are helping to grow, cultivate, and maintain a public resource for Nordic and Scandinavian music for those with an insatiable hunger for understanding Nordic and Scandinavian music history and traditions. In other words, the resource that I wish that I had when I was younger and when I first became a music student. Whether you want to learn more about the folk dances of Jämtland, the Skaldic poetry of Iceland's Middle Ages, the adventures and misadventures of Norway's violin virtuoso Ole Bull, or the revived pagan ceremonies of Midgardsblót, the Nordic Sound is here for those who seek it. And this is why patron support is so valuable to the Nordic Sound as a grassroots Nordic music archive without precedent. Let's all create this resource together. So thank you for coming with me on this journey, and I look forward to seeing you over on the Patreon and over at the Nordic Sound Archive. Thank you for watching.